let's talk about what the Prime Minister has announced. She has announced the opportunity for a delay to Brexit. How many times did you promise people that we were going to leave the EU on March the 29th?
Well, of course, it's entirely possible that we will do so if the House of Commons votes for the Prime Minister's deal. And here is, we've discussed this several times on this programme before, there are limited options for us here. Do we leave the EU with a deal? Do we leave the EU without a deal? Or do we not leave the EU at all? I've always seen the biggest danger in this Parliament is that we have a Parliament with a Remainer majority that would try to keep us in or delay Brexit as long as possible. Therefore, I hope we get the deal and that we get the process moving where we move to the implementation period. If we don't, the Prime Minister's made it clear, then the Parliament would get a chance to have a delay to Brexit. The question, therefore, is how.
Why? Because again, 108 times the Prime Minister, according to Peter Bone, your colleague, said we will definitely leave on the 29th. I can promise you the 29th we go. And now she's saying, well, we can have a delay. It might be a short delay, it might be a longer delay. And a lot of people are looking at that, highly suspicious, and in some cases very angry.
Because there seems to be a clear majority in Parliament to pass legislation to keep us in the EU if we're not willing to seek a delay. Now, the idea of Parliament taking control of the process rather than the government is something which has quite profound constitutional implications. We don't have a majority.
Sounds like a panic measure.
Well, we don't have a majority in the House of Commons, and the majority of MPs in the House of Commons were Remainers in the referendum. My view is that 80% of those MPs were elected on a manifesto promise, including those who've broken away from the Labour Party, to honour that referendum, and I think we should do so.
Do you accept that you'll be going back on your promise if we don't leave the EU at the end of March?
Well, I hope we will be leaving at the end of March.
I know, but it's breaking a promise, isn't it?
Well, it would be very unfortunate were that to happen, but if we have no option in order to deliver a smooth Brexit, then so be it. I think it's important also for your viewers to understand the limitations on that. First of all, this is not a unilateral call by Parliament. This has to be agreed, not just by the European Commission, but by every single one of the 27 governments.
But regular and enthusiastic viewers of this programme may remember you sitting in that very seat and saying, if we were to delay, it would mean going back on our word. If we extend Article 50, we would be going back on the promise that we made. And that is now what you're proposing.
Well, and I hope we can avoid that because I voted to leave the European Union. I've always wanted to leave at the end of Article 50 on the 29th of March. It's up to those MPs who were elected on a promise to their voters to honour the referendum, in my view, to do the honourable thing and vote for the Prime Minister's agreement and leave on the 29th of March.
This proposal to extend, if it happens, is that going to be a whip to vote, or will you, as somebody who wanted to leave on the 29th of March, be able to vote against it?
Well, that will be up to the Prime Minister and the so-called usual channels to determine that.
Okay.
But what I want is for us to be able to leave on the 29th of March, because I think that is how we honour the pledge we made to the voters at the last general election.
What about the apparent olive branch by the European Reform Group, the ERG, the so-called hard Brexiteers, this morning in the paper? If you look through it, do you regard that as an olive branch? I know it was reported that some MPs have called them a death cult this morning. Not number 10, I should say. Some other MPs have called them a death cult.
Yeah, it doesn't really help our case for colleagues talking about others in those sort of terms. We've got a serious issue to deal with. I think that they've made it very clear that if the effect of any change is to give the guarantees on the Irish backstop that they sought, then that would be sufficient, rather than demanding that it has to be done by one mechanism or another.
But they're still asking for either a delay, a time limit, or else an ejector seat, in effect. Both things the EU has said again and again and again are not on offer. So the more closely you look at that, it's a big olive branch with which they're going to hit you over the head.
Well, I hope it's a genuine attempt, and I think it is, to try to map out ground where we can have common territory in the run-up to the vote before the 12th of March.
Okay, here's, I suppose, the fundamental point. What would be the point of a delay? Because if there's a delay and another period of negotiation for several weeks or several months, something clearly has to change. Either the EU is going to change its position fundamentally, no sign of that, or else the government's going to change. Is the government going to change its position in any meaningful way in a further period of negotiation?
So it's a great question, if I may say. Why delay? Number one would be if we had an agreement, but we needed time to get the legalities done, to get the legislation through Parliament that gave effect to the change. I don't think
pause, really.
what you might call an administrative extension, which I don't think anyone would disagree with. The second would be because we had no deal and we wanted more time to prepare the practicalities on both sides.
Because we're not really ready for that at the moment.
There may well be improvements that could be made to that. The third option would be that there was an attempt for us not to leave at all. Now, I think that's where you come constitutionally unstuck, because I think that to attempt to have a delay mechanism in order to thwart the process of Brexit itself is actually politically completely unacceptable, and as I've said before, would provide a backlash. Provoke a backlash amongst voters.
The Prime Minister has talked about a relatively short delay, but of course it's not entirely in our gift. If the EU came back and said, yes, you can have a delay to Article 50, 2 years or 21 months or something like that, what would your reaction be?
I would be shocked, because I think it's actually not a possible outcome. The one thing that we know is that the European Union does not want Britain to fight the European elections, and to have the next European Parliament having a large group of disgruntled British MEPs there who are unlikely to be very constructive in the process. So all the indications are they don't want that to happen. The indications from the European Court are that they would interpret it as being a one-off and short extension.
Then that be that. Okay, let's turn to trade. Many times you've said in public that there are 40 EU, it's in fact 37 trade deals that need to be rolled over by the time we leave. How are we doing?
So if we leave with an agreement, which is the government's policy, of course, then we have an agreement with the European Union that we would be deemed to be a part of all of those, in which case they would all roll over. In the event of no deal, in the event of no deal, our aim has to be to maintain the majority of the trade that comes within that. To put it in context, 48% of our trade is with the European Union, 52% is outside the European Union. Of that 52%, 11% comes under EU FTAs, of which about 5.5% is dependent upon the agreement itself.
But in terms of the number of agreements, you told me back in January they were all on track and so on. Helpfully, your department then had a document leaked, which was a presentation, I think, to business. It was leaked to the Sun, and that shows us what the department, at that stage, just a couple of weeks ago, thought was the case. And we have a helpful graphic to show you. So here is the graphic. On track, 6 deals, including, admittedly, Switzerland, a big one. Off track, 8 deals, and that includes big ones like Canada, not ready yet. Significantly off track, 19 deals. 19 deals not ready at all, including Mexico, and not possible, 4 deals. And that includes Japan, a really, really big one. That suggests that you have failed.
Well, first of all, let me deal with the Japan question, because that agreement only came into place on the 1st of February, and the impact of that doesn't come until January 2020. So
they've done a deal with the EU, so the EU is now in a stronger position with Japan than we would be on WTO terms.
Japan has said in the event of no deal on the 29th of March, they would prefer to have a new bilateral agreement with the UK.
Which they haven't got.
Which we haven't started, but that's what they want to do. They believe it can be concluded quickly. So that most of our trade with Japan has never been done under the Japan EPA. It's been done under World Trade Organization terms. In terms of some of the other agreements,
are those figures, broadly speaking, right or broadly speaking, wrong?
They are out of date. A number of agreements are very close. The point is this: a lot of countries are waiting to see what we do in the next couple of weeks. If there is going to be no deal, a lot of those countries will be willing to sign what we have agreed with them now.
So
but on the other hand, if they want to have flexibility in an implementation period, they will play their cards close to their chest. This will be something that runs right up to the wire.
So how many are on track now?
A substantial proportion of the trade covered by the trade agreement's continuity
More than 6.
Will be covered.
More than 6.
Well, you could get, actually, of those agreements, you could get 30 of the 37 and cover under 25% of the respective trade. That's 25% of 11%.
It just seems to me, if this is anything like accurate, it may be out of date, but if it's anything like accurate, you are way behind on what you promised. You said, we are going to replicate the 40 EU free trade agreements that exist before we leave the European Union. That's only a couple of weeks away now. So we've got no disruption of trade. You're not getting there, are you?
Well, that's the point, is that we want to maximise the amount of that bit of our trade that's covered. Remember, of that, we're talking about probably about 5.5% of Britain's total trade. Most of our trade being done on WTO terms, for example, with the US, which, when you consider all of those agreements together, is totally 11%, of about half of which is done tariff-free, so it doesn't affect it. And the US is about 20% of our trade.
Just in terms of individual deals, how many are now on track?
That is
you
something.
You must know the answer.
Yeah, but we have, what we are doing is completely commercially very sensitive, and we will keep on the case of every one of those till the very last minute. And a lot of countries will not make up their minds to have a final agreement until we get to those last days before Brexit.
I suspect the answer is 7, but I also need to ask you how many are off track.
Well, again, we are working with all of those for as long as possible. The biggest ones are the ones that we've got the greatest agreement on. A number of those that were on your chart as being significantly off track, we are very close to concluding, for example.
All right, well, let's turn to the big prize in all of this, which is a really big trade deal with the United States. Now, this week, the US ambassador in London gave some pretty severe markers about what they would expect in return for that. And he described European agriculture as a kind of museum agriculture, very traditional, very behind the scenes. American agriculture as being much more scientifically effective and better for the environment. Do you agree with him, by and large, about that?
No, the New Zealand special advisor, for example, I was just saying yesterday that he doesn't regard Britain as being behind the curve on these farming methods, and that our farming is efficient and effective.
Do you think that we will eventually have to accept things like hormone-treated beef and chlorine-washed chicken as the price of doing a big, comprehensive trade deal with the US, which we as a country will need?
Well, we will want. Most of our trade, as I say, the US is our biggest trading partner at the moment, is done under WTO terms. Are there things that we could improve? Yes, there are some things in goods trade. There's a lot in services trade. Will we accept things that we believe are against the interests of our consumers or our producers? No, we won't. It's a negotiation.
But we now know what they want, and they've been very, very clear about it. Can I ask you, have you talked to any of them about hormone-treated beef, for instance, arriving in British supermarkets?
Well, we're not at the beginning of those discussions yet. We can't have those negotiations until we leave the European Union. Have we made clear our general stance? Yes, we have. It's worth pointing out that the 136 negotiating objectives, which the US have outlined, are exactly the same as they have with the EU, bar 2, one of which is about goods trade, and one of which is about intellectual property. So it's exactly what we'd have expected. It's what the US normally do when they set out a process like this. But in a negotiation, there are things that we will want, things that they will want.
Is there any chance whatever that we would allow hormone-treated beef into this country?
Well, if you look at what happened with the EU discussion with the US, the discussion there came down to the US saying, well, if you won't accept our hormone-treated beef, you'll have to accept more of our non-hormone-treated beef as part of the negotiation. That's how those negotiations work. Agriculture is very often one of the sticking points. But there's no doubt, for example, if you take the chlorine-washed chicken, a lot of our food is already chlorine-washed, the salads that we get. The question is not about safety. The question is about the implications for animal welfare further down the track.
All right, let me ask you finally, if you get the deal you want with the United States, if you do really good free trade deals with Japan and India and the other big economies around the world, if you're highly successful, what will that do to our overall economic growth?
Well, it will depend on the growth in those other markets. If you look at what the IMF are telling us,
I can show you what your government says. Your government suggests that the overall effect would just be 0.2% in economic growth, which compares to less growth of nearly 4% under the Brexit deal and less growth of 9% if we have no deal. So it's completely dwarfed this by what's going to happen as a result of leaving the EU.
Well, of course, we want to have an open and comprehensive agreement with the European Union so that we're getting access to that European market and we're getting access to those growth markets. Now, what is not included in that calculation is what will happen to the service sectors of those countries as they expand. And the IMF say 90% of global growth in the next 5 years will be outside continental Europe. That is where we need to be. There is a world beyond Europe, and there'll be a time beyond Brexit.